Welcome back in Solitude with me, DJ Hero. In this video, I'm going to talk about what I call the V theory of music production. Simply put, at the bottom of the V is the narrow point, and at the top of the V are the wide edges. At the bottom of the V is the narrow point, right? It has no width. It's in the center. It is mono. Let's think about that as the low end of our frequency spectrum, the bass. As we move up the V, it gets wider. So, down at the lowest frequency, the bass, the V theory says we start mono in the center, and as we move up the frequency spectrum, we get progressively wider like this. As you can hear and see on the analyzer as the sound plays, it started mono down at 20 hertz, and as it climbed all the way up to 16,000 hertz, it got wider. But what does this mean relative to music production? In general, we have four basic sound groups in our music. We have the sub bass, the low end, the mid bass, kind of the low mids, the vocals, mid range, and the brighter melodies, the mid highs and highs. Obviously, these aren't the only sounds in our music. This is a simplified look at what we're going to do just to start off. The first one, the sub bass, should be mono. It's at the very bottom point of the V. From there, the V theory says the mid bass should be a little wider, the vocals wider still, and the bright melodies the widest. This way, every sound group or frequency range has its own space in the mix. This is going to allow us to ensure our mix is filled out as much as possible from top to bottom and left to right. We'll fill the center of the mix. We'll fill the extreme ends of the stereo spectrum, the sides, left and right, and everything in between. It will also provide some separation between the sound groups in the mix. The bass will have its own place, separate from the mid-range sound, which are also separate from the sounds that fill out the high end of the mix. When you're producing, whether you mix as you go or save it until the end, think about which sounds in your track fill those four roles I mentioned a minute ago. Keep this in mind. At this point, we're only talking about the four main sounds you've chosen, the most important sounds to the track. That's it. Adjust those sounds so that they follow the theory as we've described it thus far. If you're making EDM, you've got all the ingredients, the sub, the mid bass, a vocal perhaps, a lead melody. The V theory is rather easy to describe here. But what if you're making something less complex like tech house? The same thing applies. What are the most important sounds to the track? The bass, easily enough, follow the same rule. But now, instead of music sounds and melodies, you have more percussive and FX sounds filling the roles of the most important spots. Treat those as you would the sounds like melodies, pads, or vocals. Something to keep in mind here. You may not be making most drums wider, but you can still fill the mix with ping pong effects or panning. Let's have a listen. As usual, the kick drum has been centered, mono. My claps I'm treating more like they're in the mid-range, so they're going to be a little wider. The toms and the floor toms here also going to be centered because they are kind of contributing to the low end in the rhythm. But the bongo, what I've done here, is I've panned it a little bit. To give it some width, since it does take up kind of that mid-high range. I have a few different hats involved here. I have a closed hat, which I've decided to keep fairly mono, and an open hat, which I've really widened out. And then as well, I have a ride here, which I felt textured more a little underneath this open hat. So it's not quite as wide as that open hat, but if you put the three together, and then to really fill it out, what I've got here is this wood block, and I've added a ping pong effect so that it bounces left and right. So all of the percussion together still fills out that entire V, from the low end of the kick and the toms up to the mid-range of the clap and the mid-high tom, up to the high end, the hi-hats and the ride. And then additionally, I have one musical element going on here, this TB303. Now, the 303 in and of itself is a mono sound without all of the effects on it. It is just in the center. And then what I did to fill this out, rather than make the sound wide, was use effects, reverb, and delay to fill that space for the sound. So that as a whole, the mix is nice and full. All right, I've got an example here in front of me. It's a simple EDM breakdown. It has a kick, some percussive elements, a bass line, a couple of synth elements, and some effects to fill it out. The four elements I've chosen to focus on are the kick, the sub, the arpeggiator, and the lead synth. This is a construction kit that I picked up, so my choices are a bit limited. To apply the V theory, I started with the kick. It's primarily a sub-bass sound, and if you've watched my previous video in Solitude with DJ Hero tutorial number 5, processing and mixing percussion, you know I prefer my kick drum in mono, so I've added a utility and set the output of the kick to -7 decibels so I can mix all of my sounds around it. Once I've got my kick placed, I move next to the sub. I prefer to work with all of the low-end sounds first, just kind of the way I like to do it. Here's the sound dry, just so that we get an idea, a representation of what the sound is before I did anything to it. You can see and hear that it is really wide as a whole through the entire range of frequencies that it fills out. What I've done here is split the sound into two parts, the low and the mid highs. I've made the sub mono. You can see I've added the utility and checked off the mono setting, and I've used an EQ to cut all the frequencies above 150 hertz. It sounds like this. And then I've taken the mid-highs and used an EQ to cut oppositely, so 150 hertz on up through the rest of the spectrum. And then I've added a utility to it as well to make the sound a bit more narrow. I didn't like that it was really wide. Remember, this is in the mid to mid-low range as far as frequencies go, so I don't want it really wide in the mix. I've decreased the width by about 40% or to 40%, and it sounds like this. And then the sound as a whole. I want this sound to be more centered, but not fully mono in the mix. After setting the kick and the bass, balancing them together properly, I switch to the arpeggiator. This sound sweeps through the mix with a filter cutoff. What I've done is used a utility in tandem with the cutoff so that it is more narrow when the cutoff is down low, and as the cutoff opens up, the utility widens to give the sound more life, like this. As a side note, if you're using the Ableton utility, be careful not to make it too wide. I typically stop at 100%. If you go past that, especially if you go to its full range of 400%, you risk that sound not being heard on more lo-fi systems. It'll be too wide and it'll just phase out of the mix. Because the arpeggiator plays a portion of the lead drop, somewhat like a call and respond type of sound, I want it to be 100% wide, full in the mix. If it were layered under the lead synth as a texture, I might choose to make that different, make it a bit more narrow to complement the lead synth in the mix. So let's switch to that lead synth. That's a pretty complicated sound that's kind of all over the place. It's warm and full. It's got a bit of low end, obviously full in the mids. It's also really wide and really bright. To kind of get this sound in control, what I've done is I've split it into 3 ranges using an effects rack. Ideally, I would do all of this in the synth or synths before getting to this stage, but because I'm working with a pre-made sample, I've got to get clever. Incidentally, this is exactly why I refuse to use pre-made sounds. I'd rather engineer all of my sounds from scratch using synthesis or live recordings whenever possible. You just get better control out of all of the effects and dynamics. You get just better sound. And then, of course, your final product is also going to be better because of that. When you're using pre-made loops, you have to force that loop and all of its effects that are already on it into the track that you're making. So I like to stay as original and engineer everything as much as possible. With that being said, here's what I've got. The lows, I've used an EQ to cut it so that it only goes from 20 hertz to 150 hertz. The mids have an EQ cutting everything below 150 hertz, where the sub's going to be, and then plays only up to 2000 hertz, cutting everything above 2000 hertz, so that on the high end here, we've cut everything below 2000 hertz, where the sub and the mids go, it's only going to be playing the high end on up through 16,000 hertz. Back down to the lows here. Again, I've used my utility to make it mono. It sounds like this. The mids, again, added a utility to make it a little less wide, narrowing it just a little bit. It sounds like this. And then on the highs, I've not used a utility at all. I want it to be as wide as it naturally is. We're just having the EQ to carve out that frequency spectrum, like this. And I've used brick wall cuts on all of the EQs so that the different frequency ranges don't bleed into each other, causing any phasing issues. And then additionally, I've added a little multi-band compression here in the form of the OTT. Subtle amount, not full. I'm not trying to really crush this thing, but just kind of glue everything back together after I've made those cuts. Also, I've used the volumes on each of these individual chains so that I could balance the sound and each frequency levels a little bit better before I add this OTT on here, this multi-band compressor. But as a whole, once I've got everything carved out, placed in the V the way I want it to, it sounds and looks like this. What I've accomplished here is I've kept the sound full from top to bottom, as well as filling the entire stereo spectrum. More importantly, I've made efficient use of the space this sound uses in the mix. What I mean is a really wide sub frequency is going to eat up overhead really quickly. That's why I keep it mono. And by narrowing the mid-range a little bit, I've left some room for another sound that might need that range or might sit nicely in the mix in that range. From there, I check to see that the arpeggiator and the lead synth are balanced together with respect to their relative volumes. And then for some fun, I've grouped the sounds together and added some additional multi-band compression just to mix them a little bit better. Together, they sound like this. And that is that for our four main sounds: the kick, the sub, the arpeggiator, and the lead synth. Once you've got the foundation in place, you can start placing all of the other sounds in the mix wherever you think your track needs them, or wherever they best fit around the main character of the mix. You can see I've still got the percussion sounds, the fills, and the effects to place in the mix. I've added some width automation to the white noise effect so that it plays off of what the synths are doing. It sounds like this. You can see the automation here. Starts wide and then gets more mono as we move down the frequency range. This one started in a lower frequency range and got wider as it gets to the top, this brighter end of that white noise, so it gets wider here. And what I've done there is when we play it with the synths, here it gets more mono, wider, fading in more mono, and then it builds out wider as the cutoff of the arpeggiator opens up. As that sound goes to the higher frequency, it gets to the top of the V in our V theory. I've opted to keep the build-up fills more narrow so that I've left some stereo space for the ride that sits on top of them like this. You can hear that I've made the ride really quite wide using an effects rack, a mono and a stereo. Again, so that the mid-highs of this build-up fill are less wide than the higher highs of the ride itself. As a whole, it sounds like this. The idea of the V theory is to make sure you're filling out the entire mix and leaving room for all of your sounds within the mix, from the low end to the high end, and the full stereo spectrum, left, right, and center. If you remember from my previous video, I think of music production and sound like a box. We want to fill the entire box evenly so that our mixes are full. And what I mean by full is they fill the entire stereo spectrum, they fill the entire frequency range, and they fill the depth of the mix, front to back. So keep this in mind every tune you produce. The bottom of the V, the low end, is narrow in the mix, and as you move up the V through the frequency spectrum, your sounds will get wider and wider, filling the full stereo spectrum. The V theory, coupled with proper EQing and compression, is going to allow you to fit more into the box as well as fill the box out, creating a really rich soundscape in every tune you produce. Now, I know my example was rather simple and it was just a breakdown, not much going on. So I want to stress, this is a guideline. It's not a hard rule. As far as I'm concerned, the only hard rule in music production is to gain stage every plugin and channel so that you don't have any clipping. But with that said, choose the 4 main sounds, place them in the V, then mix all of the other sounds around them, keeping in mind, what frequency range does this sound sit in most? What is this sound's relation to the 4 main sounds? And are there any gaps this sound can fill or needs to fill? Like I hinted at earlier, it's easy to describe the V theory using bigger sounds and genres like EDM and trance or even my obnoxious breaks, but you're really going to have to think about it when you're making more subtle genres like deep house, tech house, or some of the left field genres. Most importantly though, be creative. I hope you've learned something. If you have any additional questions, please leave them in the comments below, or if you have any ideas for future topics, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification button. If you want more from me, search Originaldjhero, all one word, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, SoundCloud, and Mixcloud, or search DJ Hero on Beatport, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. Until next time, good luck, have fun. We'll see you soon.